3A, which seat?
Fake federal ID says she's a judge. Ma'am, stand. Hands where I can see
I am
them.
Denise Lockhart, United States District Judge. You can verify it right now.
It's fake. You know how they do this. Tougher. Hands behind your back.
You're making a career-ending mistake.
You're making a career.
At 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, a black woman was handcuffed in the first-class cabin of a Sterling Atlantic Airlines flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't broken a single regulation. She had done nothing but sit in a seat she paid for, open a laptop, and ask a flight attendant for his name. The woman was the Honorable Denise Lockhart, a United States federal judge with 11 years on the bench, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The man who triggered her arrest was Craig Pennington, a senior flight attendant with 8 years at the airline and 31 complaints from passengers of color that his employer had buried and never acted on. He looked at her and decided she didn't belong, and before that plane touched the ground, he would set in motion a chain of events that would cost Sterling Atlantic $3.5 million, end his career, and land him in a federal courtroom on the wrong side of a civil rights charge. Judge Lockhart was 54 years old. She had spent more than 2 decades in law, first as a public defender, then as a federal prosecutor, and for the last 11 years as a U.S. District Judge for the District of Columbia. She was flying home from visiting her elderly mother and was due in chambers the next morning to preside over a high-profile discrimination case. She dressed comfortably. A dark cardigan, reading glasses around her neck, a leather bag with case files, no title on display. She walked to seat 3A, placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, and sat down. She was one of 4 passengers in first class. She was the only one who was black. Craig Pennington stood at the front of the cabin watching passengers file in. He was 46 years old, 18 years with Sterling Atlantic, and held the title of lead cabin crew. Among colleagues, he was known for running a tight cabin, a phrase that in his case meant controlling who got attention and who got ignored. Over 9 years, 31 passengers had filed complaints against him. Every single one was a person of color. The complaints described the same patterns: boarding passes questioned, drink service skipped, seats double-checked. In one case, a black surgeon had been asked 3 times whether he was sure he was in the right cabin. Each complaint was closed without action. Pennington had never been disciplined, never been retrained, never been told to change. That afternoon, he watched Lockhart settle into 3A, and his eyes stayed on her a beat too long. Before the doors closed, Pennington approached her row. "Ma'am, I just need to verify your boarding pass." Lockhart handed it over. He studied it longer than necessary, turned it over, held it at an angle. The pass was clear. First class, seat 3A, paid in full. "There might be a seating error in the system," he said. "I need to sort this out." Lockhart's voice was calm. "There's no error. That's my seat." He walked toward the galley. He didn't check a single other passenger's pass. Not the white businessman in 3C. Not the couple in row 2. Only Lockhart. He returned 4 minutes later. "Ma'am, other passengers have expressed concern about a possible mix-up." No other passenger had said a word. Lockhart met his eyes. "I'm where I'm supposed to be." Pennington held the look, then turned and walked away. His expression was tight. Lockhart watched him go. She had been a judge long enough to recognize what was happening. She had also been a black woman long enough to know exactly what it looked like. The flight leveled at cruising altitude, and Pennington began first-class service. He started at row 1, hot towels, drinks, a warm smile. He moved to row 2, same routine. He stopped at row 3, served the white businessman in 3C a whiskey neat in a glass tumbler, exchanged a few words, and then walked past Lockhart without a glance. He continued to the row behind her. The older white couple received their drinks within minutes. Lockhart sat with nothing. She waited. After several minutes, she pressed the call button above her seat. The chime sounded. Pennington was visible near the galley, arranging a tray. He didn't look up. 14 minutes passed before he appeared at her row. "Sorry about that. Galley's backed up right now. What can I get you?" She asked for a glass of water. He nodded and walked away. She watched him stop at the row behind her, refill the couple's wine, and chat briefly before disappearing into the galley again. 20 minutes later, he returned with her water. It was lukewarm, served in a small plastic cup, the kind used in economy. Every other first-class passenger had crystal glassware. Lockhart looked at the cup, then at Pennington. He was already turning away. A second flight attendant, Nora Saunders, 28, 2 years with the airline, stood near the galley partition. She had watched the entire sequence. Her lips pressed together. She shifted her weight. She said nothing. Lockhart set the plastic cup on her tray table, reached into her bag, and quietly opened the voice memo app on her phone. She placed it face down beside her and pressed record. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a scene. She simply began documenting what she already knew wasn't going to stop. Midway through the flight, Lockhart opened her laptop. She logged into the federal court's secure document system and began reviewing case files for the discrimination trial she was set to preside over the following morning. Her screen showed legal briefs, sealed motions, judicial notes. She worked quietly, the way she had on dozens of flights before. Pennington walked down the aisle carrying a tray of empty glasses. He slowed as he passed row 3. His eyes moved to her screen. He didn't stop, but his pace changed. He looked at the laptop, then at Lockhart, then continued toward the front galley. He set the tray down and picked up the in-flight phone that connected directly to the cockpit. "Captain, this is Pennington. I've got a passenger in 3A I need to flag. She's been behaving suspiciously since boarding. She's accessing some kind of material on a laptop that doesn't look right. I don't think she matches the profile of a first-class passenger." There was a pause. The captain asked if the passenger had been disruptive. "Not yet," Pennington said, "but you know how these things escalate. I'd rather be safe." The captain asked what specifically was suspicious. Pennington hesitated for half a second. "She's just not right. Something's off. I'm calling it a security concern." The captain, following airline protocol that gave lead cabin crew authority to flag in-flight threats, contacted Sterling Atlantic ground operations at Dulles. He relayed the crew's concern. Ground operations contacted Airport Police Dispatch and requested that law enforcement officers meet Flight 4721 at the gate upon arrival. The request was logged as a potential security incident. At 30,000 feet, with no crime committed and no regulation broken, the machinery had already started moving, and Lockhart, still reviewing her case files, had no idea what was waiting for her on the ground. Pennington came back down the aisle 10 minutes later. This time, his posture was different. Shoulders squared, clipboard in hand, jaw set. He stopped at row 3 and looked down at Lockhart. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to close that laptop and stow all personal items immediately. Security protocol." Lockhart looked up from her screen. "Which protocol?" Pennington's eyes flickered. "It's a cabin security protocol. I need you to comply." Lockhart's voice remained even. "There is no FAA regulation that requires a passenger to close a laptop during cruise altitude. I'm not in violation of anything. Which specific protocol are you referring to?" Pennington couldn't name one. His grip tightened on the clipboard. "Ma'am, if you don't comply with crew instructions, I will have you restrained and removed from this aircraft upon landing." The cabin went quiet. The older couple behind her stopped mid-conversation. The man in 1A lowered his newspaper. The white businessman in 3C leaned forward and spoke. "She hasn't done anything. I've been sitting here the entire flight. She's been reading on her laptop. That's it." Pennington's head snapped toward him. "Sir, this doesn't involve you. I'd suggest you stay out of it." The businessman held his gaze for a moment, then sat back, shaking his head. 2 rows behind Lockhart, a woman traveling with her teenage daughter quietly raised her phone and began recording. She angled it carefully, capturing Pennington standing over Lockhart's seat, his posture aggressive, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. Lockhart hadn't moved. Her hands were still on the keyboard. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She had spent her career watching people abuse authority. She recognized the pattern. She also recognized that this was no longer just poor service. It was something else entirely. Pennington didn't walk away. He planted himself beside row 3 and raised the stakes. "Ma'am, I'm now going to need you to hand over that laptop." It's being classified as evidence related to a security concern. Lockhart closed the laptop slowly, but kept it on her tray table. Her voice was clear enough for the rows around her to hear. You have no authority to seize my personal property. I am a fare-paying passenger in a confirmed seat. I have broken no law and violated no regulation. You are not law enforcement. Pennington's face flushed. He turned toward the galley and called out, Nora, come here. Nora Saunders appeared from behind the partition. Pennington pointed at Lockhart. I need you to stay here and keep eyes on this passenger in case she becomes aggressive. Nora looked at Lockhart, a 5-4-year-old woman, sitting still with her hands folded on a closed laptop. Nora's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She stepped to the side of the aisle and stood there, arms crossed, visibly uncomfortable. She didn't say a word. Lockhart turned back to Pennington. I'd like your full name and employee identification number. Pennington stiffened. That's not something I'm required to give you. She asked again, louder this time, her voice carrying through the first-class cabin. I am asking for your name and your employee ID. I have a right to know who is threatening me on this aircraft. Pennington leaned in close enough that only she should have heard what he said next. You're going to regret making this difficult. But 2 rows back, the mother's phone was still recording. The microphone picked up every word. Pennington straightened up and walked back toward the galley. Lockhart sat motionless, her phone still recording face down beside her. She was no longer just a passenger being mistreated. She was a federal judge building a record. The plane touched down at Dulles at 7:12 p.m. Before the seatbelt sign clicked off, Pennington's voice came over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We have a brief security procedure before deplaning. Do not stand or open the overhead bins until instructed. The cabin stirred. Passengers exchanged looks. This wasn't normal for a domestic flight. Lockhart sat still in 3A, laptop stowed, hands resting on her lap. She already knew. The forward cabin door opened, and 2 armed airport police officers stepped on board. They were directed immediately to row 3. Officer Vince Delano, 36, led the way. His partner followed a step behind, hand resting near his belt. Pennington intercepted them before they reached Lockhart. He spoke in a low voice, but not low enough. She's been non-compliant since boarding. Aggressive, refused direct orders from cabin crew. I flagged it as a possible security threat. I'd be careful with her. Delano looked past Pennington toward 3A. He saw a middle-aged woman sitting upright, hands visible, expression calm. No raised voice, no disturbance, no indication of anything resembling a threat. He approached her row. Ma'am, I need you to stand up, please. Lockhart stood. He asked for identification. She reached into her bag, opened her wallet, and produced a federal judicial ID card. It showed her photograph, her full name, her title, the Honorable Denise Lockhart, and her court, United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Delano looked at the ID. He looked at Pennington, who stood behind him near the galley. He looked back at the ID. The cabin was silent. Every passenger in first class was watching. The businessman in 3C had his jaw tight. The older couple behind her hadn't moved. Delano held the ID in his hand for a long moment, and then he made the worst decision of his career. Delano stared at the ID. Federal Judge, U.S. District Court. The photo matched the woman standing in front of him. Before he could speak, Pennington stepped closer. She could have faked that. You don't know. People fake things all the time. Delano hesitated. He keyed the radio on his shoulder and called his supervisor. I've got a passenger in first class. Crew flagged her as a security concern. She's produced a federal judicial ID, requesting guidance. The supervisor, sitting in a dispatch office on the other side of the terminal, had no visual on the situation, no body cam footage, no context beyond what he was hearing through a radio. His response was brief. Bring her in for processing. Better safe than sorry. We'll sort it out on the ground. Delano lowered the radio. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. Lockhart didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She placed her hands behind her back, palms open. The cuffs clicked shut in the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft, in front of every passenger still seated. The mother, 2 rows back, held her phone steady. The video captured everything. A 54-year-old black woman in handcuffs, standing straight, face composed, dignity intact. And behind the officers, Craig Pennington stood with his arms crossed, chin slightly raised, watching. The mother's son, a boy of 9, stared at the scene with tears running down his face. His mother leaned close and whispered, "Don't look away. Remember this." Delano and his partner walked Lockhart up the aisle toward the cabin door. Passengers pressed against their seats to make room. No one spoke. She was led through the jet bridge in handcuffs, past gate agents who stopped mid-task, past waiting passengers who turned and stared, past a Sterling Atlantic supervisor who looked at the cuffs and then looked away. Not one of them asked what she had done, because she hadn't done anything. The airport police station was a windowless room on the lower level of Dulles Terminal. Fluorescent lights, a metal table, 2 chairs. Lockhart was seated on one side, hands still cuffed behind her back. She hadn't said a word since leaving the plane. Delano sat across from her with a clipboard. He asked for her full name, Denise Yvonne Lockhart, occupation, United States District Judge, District of Columbia. She gave him her chamber's direct number and the name of her judicial assistant. Delano wrote it down, then stepped out. He made the call from the hallway. Federal court security answered on the second ring. It took less than 3 minutes. The Honorable Denise Lockhart, appointed by the President, confirmed by the United States Senate, 11 years on the federal bench, active caseload including a civil rights trial scheduled to begin the following morning. Delano walked back into the room. The color had left his face. His partner, who had been standing near the door, looked at him once and stepped out without a word. Lockhart watched Delano set the clipboard down. His hands weren't steady. She spoke first. "I told you who I was on the plane. I showed you my identification. You looked at it, and you chose not to listen. Uncuff me." Delano moved behind her and removed the handcuffs. The red marks on her wrists were already visible. He started to speak. "Judge Lockhart, I'm sorry, She cut him off. "Don't apologize to me. That's not what I need from you right now. What I need is for you to document everything that happened on that aircraft and in this room. Every word that flight attendants said to you, every instruction your supervisor gave, every second I spent in these cuffs. Because this is not over." Delano nodded. He picked up his pen. His hand was shaking. The call started before Lockhart left the station. Her senior law clerk, reached by phone at 8:40 p.m., contacted the federal court's administrative office immediately. By 9:15 p.m., the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia was on a call with the Department of Justice. The message was direct. A sitting federal judge had been handcuffed and detained on a commercial flight based on nothing but the word of a flight attendant and the color of her skin. The DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a preliminary inquiry that same night. Agents were assigned. Evidence preservation requests were sent to Sterling Atlantic Airlines, to Dulles Airport Police, and to the airline's ground operations office. Lockhart provided her audio recording, over 40 minutes of continuous documentation, including Pennington's whispered threat, his fabricated security claims, and the moment the cuffs went on. The mother's video surfaced on social media within 24 hours. It was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. It showed Pennington standing over Lockhart's seat. It showed the officers approaching. It showed a 54-year-old black woman being handcuffed in first class while a flight attendant watched from the galley with his arms crossed. It showed a 9-year-old boy crying. Within a day, the video had 2 million views. By the end of the week, it had passed 11 million. National news networks ran it on every cycle. Legal experts appeared on cable broadcasts calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of racial discrimination on a commercial flight in recent memory. Sterling Atlantic Airlines released a statement. The airline is aware of the incident and is conducting a thorough internal review. We are committed to the safety and dignity of all passengers. The statement said nothing about Pennington. Nothing about the 31 prior complaints. Nothing about the federal judge they had allowed to be arrested on their aircraft. It said nothing because they were already afraid of what was coming. Lockhart retained civil rights attorney Claudia Ferreira, a former DOJ prosecutor who had built a reputation dismantling institutional discrimination cases with surgical precision. Ferreira filed a federal lawsuit against Sterling Atlantic Airlines, Craig Pennington individually, and the Dulles Airport Police Authority. The claims included racial discrimination, unlawful detention, civil rights violations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Then discovery began, and what it revealed was worse than anyone outside the airline could have imagined. Internal records showed all 31 complaints against Pennington. Every single one involved a passenger of color. Every single one had been closed without discipline. HR emails between supervisors described Pennington as old-fashioned and a bit rough around the edges, but ultimately harmless. One email from a regional HR manager advised a black woman who had filed a complaint that crew discretion in managing cabin dynamics was standard practice across the industry, and that her experience, while regrettable, did not constitute a policy violation. Training records showed that Sterling Atlantic's entire diversity and inclusion program consisted of a single 4-5-minute online video module. 40% of cabin crew had never completed it. Pennington was among them. But the most damaging evidence came from Pennington's own company email account. He had sent messages to colleagues mocking black passengers seated in first class. One read, "Another one in 2B who clearly used someone else's miles." Another said, "Full cabin today." 3 of them up front, "Going to be a long flight." The airline had access to these emails. Their servers stored them. Their filters flagged nothing. Their managers saw the complaints pile up year after year and never once connected the dots. They knew who Pennington was. They knew what he was doing. And they did nothing because no one had made enough noise to force them to care. The DOJ Civil Rights Division moved faster than Sterling Atlantic expected. Federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence, the audio recording, the passenger video, Delano's body cam footage, Pennington's call to the cockpit, and his statements to the officers on board, and made a decision that would elevate the case beyond a civil matter. They charged Craig Pennington with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The legal theory was precise. Pennington was not law enforcement. But by contacting the captain, triggering a security alert, directing armed officers to a specific passenger, and feeding them false claims of aggression and non-compliance, he had effectively weaponized state authority against Lockhart. He had used police as an instrument of racial discrimination. That, prosecutors argued, brought his actions within the reach of federal civil rights law. Pennington was arrested at his home on a Wednesday morning. 2 federal agents knocked on his door at 6:15 a.m. His mugshot was released that afternoon and circulated nationally within hours. Sterling Atlantic suspended him immediately, calling it a personnel matter under review. Officer Vince Delano faced a separate reckoning. An internal investigation by the Airport Police Department found that he had seen valid federal judicial identification, heard a flight attendant with no law enforcement authority override that identification, and proceeded with an arrest without independent verification. He was placed on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the review. His partner was reassigned. The Airport Police Department entered into a consent agreement with the DOJ requiring new protocols for all airline-initiated law enforcement requests, including mandatory independent verification of crew claims before any passenger could be detained. The machinery of accountability was now moving on multiple tracks, and none of them were slowing down. The criminal trial began on a Monday in federal court and lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They opened with Officer Delano's body cam footage, which showed the moment he boarded the aircraft, Pennington intercepting him in the aisle, the whispered briefing, the walk to row 3, and the handcuffing of a woman who had not moved, not raised her voice, and not broken a single rule. They played the mother's cell phone video. The jury watched a 9-year-old boy cry as a 5'4" old black woman was led away in handcuffs while a flight attendant stood in the galley with his arms folded. They played Lockhart's audio recording, 40 minutes of continuous documentation, Pennington's fabricated security protocol, his demand for her laptop, his whispered threat, "You're going to regret making this difficult." They presented his emails, the jokes about black passengers in first class, the language, the tone. Then 7 other former passengers took the stand. All people of color. All had flown Sterling Atlantic and encountered Pennington. One woman described being moved from her first-class seat to economy because Pennington told her there had been an overbooking error. There hadn't been. A black professor testified that Pennington had asked to see his boarding pass 3 times on a single flight while never once checking the white passengers around him. The patterns were identical. The behavior was consistent. The airline had done nothing. Pennington's defense argued he had been following security protocols and exercising professional judgment. The prosecution dismantled this in a single afternoon. They brought Sterling Atlantic's own operations manual into evidence. No protocol existed for what Pennington had done. None. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Craig Pennington to 2 years in federal prison. He showed no reaction. Lockhart, seated in the gallery, showed none either. She didn't need to. The record spoke for itself. The civil case never reached trial. Sterling Atlantic's attorneys reviewed the evidence, the emails, the complaint history, the training failures, the video now seen by tens of millions of people, and advised the airline's board that going before a jury would be catastrophic. They settled. The total was $3.5 million, $1.8 million in direct damages to Judge Lockhart for unlawful detention, racial discrimination, emotional distress, and reputational harm. The remaining $1.7 million was allocated to fund systemic reforms mandated as part of the settlement agreement. The required changes were specific and binding. Sterling Atlantic was to establish an independent oversight board with authority to review all crew complaints involving allegations of discrimination. Quarterly bias training would be mandatory for every member of cabin crew, with written testing and documented completion. Failure to complete training would result in suspension. A passenger bill of rights would be printed and posted visibly on every aircraft in the fleet. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory service would be implemented with termination on first confirmed offense. No warnings, no reassignments, no second chances. And the airline CEO would deliver a public apology on camera, read in full, broadcast on the company's website and social media channels, acknowledging the systemic failures that had allowed Pennington's behavior to continue unchecked for nearly a decade. Lockhart sat in Ferreira's office when the settlement was finalized. She reviewed every clause. Then she made a decision about the money. She donated her entire portion to a foundation she established herself. She called it the Equal Skies Initiative. Its purpose was to provide free legal representation to airline passengers who experienced racial discrimination and didn't have the resources or the title to fight back on their own. Because Lockhart understood something clearly, she had been heard because of who she was. The foundation would exist for everyone who wasn't. Craig Pennington served 18 months in federal prison and was released on good behavior. He never issued a public apology, never acknowledged what he had done, never expressed remorse to Lockhart or to any of the passengers he had mistreated over the years. His name became a case study. Airline training programs across the country incorporated the incident into mandatory modules on bias, discrimination, and abuse of crew authority. His mugshot appeared beside the footage. His emails were quoted in slides. He became the example of exactly what the industry could no longer afford to ignore. Officer Vince Delano resigned from the airport police 3 months after the consent agreement was finalized. He left law enforcement entirely. He gave no interviews and made no public statements. His partner had already transferred to a different division before the trial began. Nora Saunders, the junior flight attendant who had stood in the aisle and said nothing while a federal judge was humiliated and handcuffed, gave a public interview 6 months after the settlement. She described the moment Pennington told her to watch Lockhart in case she became aggressive. She said she knew immediately it was wrong. She said her hands were shaking. She said she opened her mouth and nothing came out. She cried during the interview. She now works as a trainer for a national airline crew advocacy group, teaching cabin staff how to intervene when they witness discrimination by a colleague. The white businessman from 3C, a corporate executive named Leonard Ashford, wrote an op-ed for a national newspaper. He described watching the entire incident unfold from 3 feet away. He described speaking up once and being told to stay out of it. He described sitting in silence while Lockhart was cuffed and walked off the plane. He called it the moment he understood that witnessing injustice and doing the minimum were not the same thing. Lockhart returned to the bench. The civil rights case she had been flying home to preside over resulted in a landmark ruling that was cited in federal courts for years after. She never gave a single public interview about the flight, never wrote about it, never appeared on a panel or a podcast. She let the footage, the verdict, and the record speak for themselves. Sterling Atlantic's internal training video now opens with a single clip from that flight. Pennington standing in the galley with his arms crossed while a federal judge is led past him in handcuffs. The screen holds on the image for 5 seconds before a caption appears. This is what failure looks like. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.